Imagine. The year is 1349. A boy aged about 7 picks his way through the once familiar capital city. He has returned to London after a year away on the coast with his family. Everywhere has changed. The occasional wagon trundles through the narrow streets, heaped with mounds of greasy offal, blood and dung. The contents spill over, sloshing through onto the thoroughfare as each cart horse plods on at funereal pace. Where are the people? There are so few on the street. Crosses are daubed in red paint on the doors. Incense from churches pours wraith-like from each church he passes, one on every street. Pungent odours of sage, hyssop and lily flower weave in the air with the sound of muffled crying, incantations of prayer, the soft modulation of ethereal plainsong. He notices the gaps where people should be busying about, the gaps where shopkeepers used to ply their trade in animal meat and skins, wine, cloth, gossip, bustle. There are gaps everywhere, spaces drained of life. This plague his parents call the Black Death has turned his familiar world strange, his world now a thin ghost of all previous experience of his young life so far. Gaps everywhere, emptiness everywhere has changed. This is an imagined encounter by a small boy of the bubonic plague or Black Death. Today, in the midst of another pandemic of our own modern age, we may understand this child's uneasiness at these unusual absences, the unnerving but somehow inexpressible disquiet of having our expectations and our hopes turned on their head. Okay, so we no longer use herbs like hyssop and sage to ward off COVID, the pestilence of our time. But we know what it is like to be stalked by a silent killer, and we bristle in shared horror at the havoc it can wreak on the normal functioning of society. What I have described may have been the early experience of one of our greatest and most important writers. No, not Shakespeare. He comes later. Today, I'm going to be talking about Geoffrey Chaucer, whose best-known work, The Canterbury Tales, about a group of pilgrims telling each other stories, was in fact a work from whom Shakespeare himself drew inspiration. Without Chaucer, indeed, there would be no Shakespeare, because, as Chaucer wrote in an age when French was the language mostly spoken in educated circles, he utterly transformed the resources of our English language and its styles in a way that put English literature, quite literally, on the map. Chaucer has since been acclaimed as the father of English poetry by writers who came after him. For his inventiveness and telling wit, Chaucer demands the title of the ultimate storyteller and creator of characters who have lived down the ages and still leap off the page nearly 700 years later. Hello, I'm Mr. Fraser Andrews, teacher of English and creative writing at Shrewsbury. I'm also a Chaucer enthusiast, or as his friends called him, Geoffrey Chaucer. That's a Middle English pronunciation of his name. It may sound strange, even funny, but because he writes in this older form of English called Middle English, which is spoken differently and looks different, many teachers find him forbidding, and so he is in danger of disappearing from the curriculum. Well, not here, and not on my watch. I would like you to help me keep the flame alive for Chaucer, because I hope you'll find him not so very different from any other writer you may meet. Today, I would like to convince you that his powers of observation, his powers of sympathy, and his well-adjusted perspectives on human life are so fresh that we can use them as inspiration for our writing today. I think Chaucer is just what we need to approach the post-COVID world with a similar kind of optimism and quizzical, humane generosity towards the colourful varieties of the people we encounter. He observed keenly to get to know his world, and he always wrote what he knew. That's rule number one for any writer. Today you'll get to create your own Chaucer-inspired pieces later on, because even though this is a virtual lecture and I'm stuck inside this box, this will be very much an interactive lecture, an interactive process, and there shall be a number of tasks along the way which you and your classmates and your own teachers can enjoy by pausing this video. First though, some more about Chaucer himself. Chaucer was born, we think, at some point between 1340 and 1343 into what we would recognise as a wealthy middle-class family in London. His father John was a successful vintner or wine merchant, and as a young boy he found service as a page boy in the household of Elizabeth, Countess of Ulster, wife of Lionel, third son of Edward III. Geoffrey's father presumably had been able to place him among the group of young men and women serving in that royal household, a customary arrangement whereby families who could do so provided their children with opportunities for the necessary courtly education and connections to advance their careers. Well, for Chaucer, it worked. By 1359, Chaucer was a member of Edward III's army in France and was captured during the unsuccessful siege of Rheims in the beginning of what was to become known as the 100 Years' War. The king coughed up his ransom, and Chaucer served as a messenger from Calais to England during the peace negotiations of 1360. Chaucer went on to serve and survive in the reigns of two other kings, Richard II and briefly Henry IV, which, given that bloodthirsty medieval feuding between 14th century aristocrats made Game of Thrones look like a playground tiff, this was no mean feat. He must have been a smooth political operator. The court atmosphere would have been the ideal place to develop his skills as a discreet and shrewd observer of people, as he went on to demonstrate in his writing career. So wherever you are, people watch. That's rule number 2. By 1366, Chaucer had married Philippa Pan, who had been in the service of the Countess of Ulster and entered the service of Philippa of Hainault, Queen Consort of Edward III, when Elizabeth died in 1363. From Philippa, Chaucer received an annuity, in other words, a big wad of free cash, and later annuities were frequently paid to her through her husband. So Chaucer married well, but alas, we suspect, not particularly happily. The fabled bliss of wedded life gets short shrift in much of his writing, most famously in his uproarious portrait of the wife of Bath in the Canterbury Tales, who battles her way through 5 marriages. The Whiff, as she's called, this outspoken and fine example of modern womanhood, says the best kind of husband is riche and old. In her view, if they're loaded and about to die, that means she'll outlive them and inherit the money. Perhaps a rather cynical, grasping view, but you have to admit, financially sound practice, when options for women may have been otherwise limited, though not as limited as you might think. Chaucer went on to become a trusted diplomat and, as was the custom, probably a spy for the royal court. On government business, he travelled many times to Europe, where he fell in love with the writings of Italian writers Dante and Boccaccio, who went on to become a major influence on his own work. Some early 16th century editions of Boccaccio's writings we are lucky enough to have here, to own among the priceless collection of manuscripts and rare books in our own ancient library here at Shrewsbury. Chaucer was never a professional writer. He never earned his living from what he produced, as he lived before the age of the printing press, which would make profitable any kind of publishing industry. He wrote as a hobby, a sideline only, while holding down a series of demanding jobs as a high-ranking civil servant. Chaucer's first major office was as Comptroller of the Customs and Subsidy of Wool, Skins and Tanned Hides for the Port of London. This was a very important and terribly high-stress role, as England had become hugely wealthy as the epicentre for the European wool market, which is to say at the time, the global trade, the whole global trade in wool. Much of the City of London's wealth and England's wealth and power still derives from this golden economic period. The Lord Chancellor in the House of Lords still sits on a sack of wool as a sign of his authority, and Chaucer's main job was to make sure that the business community paid enough taxes to the monarch Edward III so he could fund his wars against the French. He went on to serve as an MP for Kent, a Justice of the Peace, and finally Chaucer became clerk for the King's Works, overseeing building on royal palaces and buildings such as Westminster Abbey. It was here that he was buried when he died in 1400, in what was known as Poets' Corner. But it was not for his poetry that he was buried among kings and queens, but for his public office as a civil servant. However, his final resting place has now become the traditional memorial to contributors, to the finest contributors to Britain's literary culture. Where the likes of Dickens, Hardy and Kipling are now memorialised, Chaucer provides literally the cornerstone. Not for nothing is he called the father of English poetry by another eternal resident of Poets' Corner, the Restoration poet and dramatist, John Dryden. Yet for all this monumental tradition associated with Chaucer, his writing career coincided with one of the most turbulent political periods in English history. Therefore, his writing can be viewed on the one hand as a critical commentary on the hypocrisies of the powerful, whose right to rule suffered a battering by deadly plague and revolution. The Black Death of 1348 wiped out a third of the population, and in a sickening rerun the deadly pestilence returned in 1360. Labour shortages sent the price of hitherto cheap labour soaring and rocked the feudal structure of society on which the aristocracy relied to shore up their power. Barons died, and the vacant land holdings were snapped up by an up-and-coming new mercantile class who seized opportunities to advance their wealth. Chaucer was no commoner, but he was no toff either. He occupied a privileged outsider's view on the inside track within the corridors of power in Edward III's and then Richard II's court. So he saw close up how a pandemic can shake down old certainties, just as COVID has exposed the failings of those who govern here and abroad. Some critics hold that his writings express a subtly dissident and critical voice that questions the authority of leadership that had been terminally undermined by incompetence and moral laziness. His wasn't the only angry voice, though his high-up job depended on keeping his true feelings hidden, perhaps. During his court career, he witnessed the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, which saw riots on the streets of London and left the Archbishop of Canterbury dead. While he never killed anyone, Chaucer's writing too can be seen to pull no punches in exposing the seedier corners in the all-powerful workings of the Catholic Church. In the 14th century, as we've seen in the last slide, the Pope and the Church was the supreme power to which the king and his court owed allegiance. Fabulously wealthy, ever-present and powerfully controlling, the Church's reach into ordinary lives was enormous. You can think of it as a medieval version of Google, that, as the gatekeeper to all useful information that mattered, almost always framed intellectual and theological debate. Many churchmen and churchwomen, when you think of nuns, provided Chaucer's most notable targets because the Church's heavy presence was felt everywhere. And what's more, these so-called men and women of God conspicuously failed to practice what they preached, which is the dictionary definition of hypocrisy. Characters like the monk, the friar, and the prioress are more interested in feasting, accruing wealth, and pursuing the satisfaction of their lusts than following far duller but worthier fare of celibate holy orders. There were exceptions to this roll call of dastardly clergy, corrupt as they were. The parson, though one of the poorest of the travelling band of pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales, was nevertheless considered by Chaucer as riche he was of whom he thought and work. Chaucer celebrated goodness and kindness when he found it, which brings us to rule number 3. When life is a precious resource, as it is in time of plague, good or bad, you must examine it closely as a writer. Because it's not what people say that's important, but what they do. Actions better express character than words. And so to the Canterbury Tales, or Canterbury Tales, as Chaucer's original audience would have understood them. These stories tell of a group of 31 pilgrims who meet while travelling from the Tabard Inn in Southwark in London to the shrine of St Thomas of Becket in Canterbury, who was murdered on the orders of Henry II, though Henry II denied this. As proof, you can see in the image his knights hacking the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas, to death in his very own cathedral. The thing that you have to remember about pilgrimages in medieval times is that, as well as being a form of religious observance, they were also the closest thing that medieval folk had to a holiday, to get a change of scene or a change of air. And Chaucer's work, The Canterbury Tales, reflects this. So to have fun and to pass the time, the pilgrims decide to tell each other 2 tales. One on the way there to the cathedral and then one on the journey home. That was the plan for them that Chaucer had, but alas, he died before he could finish the work. So only 24 tales, that includes about 20,000 lines of the work, survive. One of the best bits, though, of the whole thing is the introduction to the characters in what has become known as the general prologue, in which he created pen portraits from intensely observed, detailed people watching in the Tabard Inn as the pilgrims got together and got ready to go on their journey. I've already mentioned the wife of Bath and corrupt clergymen like the monk and the friar, and the comparatively saintly parson. In a bit, we'll be looking in more detail at a character with whom I hope you may be able to identify even more closely. Then you can go on to write your own portrait. But first, I'm going to read the very famous opening to the general prologue, which begins far away from the town, and perhaps is, as you'll hear, inspired by the Kent countryside in which Chaucer was living at the time of writing. Before I read it, a quick note on the pronunciation of Middle English, which you'll hear is very different to our own. Essentially, it's a phonetic language, which means you read what you see, and every syllable is pronounced. Even the K and the G in knicht, as in a very perfect gentle knicht, or as we in standard modern English would understand it, a very perfect noble knight. Because Chaucer knew how to be deferential, how to pay the proper amount of respect to aristocrats when he needed to. All of this pronunciation stuff makes it really great fun to read, and I hope you have a go after I've demonstrated how it might have been read. You can follow the extract under Task 1 in your handout as I read. When that April with his sure suitor the doctor much have pierced to the root, and bathed every vein in such liquor, of which virtue engendered is the floor. When Zephyrosic with his sweeter breath inspired hath in every holt and heath, the tundra croppice and the younger son hath in Aram his half course run, and smally fowlers make melody that sleep on all the nectar with open ease. So pricketh them natura in her courage, then longen folk to go on pilgrimage, and parmers for to seek and stronger strondes to ferne halwes, kufte in sondre londes, and specially from every sheer's ende of England to Canterbury they wend. The holy blissful martyr for to seek, that hem have holpen when that they were seek. What an amazing sentence. All of those 18 lines of poetry are just one sentence. And you'll notice how in all of these, this description of the natural world, when rain, when fresh breeze, and sunshine, and birdsong come along, it's only then we humans, who are just as much part of God's divinely created universe as anything else that is mentioned, then we find the energy to go on pilgrimage. This long and elaborate sentence is apt witness. It's an appropriate description and deeply felt approach to what is the cosmic and complicated power that he found in an eternal nature. Chaucer may have been a critic of some of the church's work practices, but when it came to appreciating God's own work, he was, in fact, quite deeply spiritual. Now, you can have a break from me and try reading it yourself and have some fun. You'll find it with a modern English translation under Task 1 in your handout. For our next task, we're going to look more closely at one of these portraits that I mentioned earlier. This pilgrim is the teenage squire, who is a knight in training and son of the warlike knight or knight, whose portrait begins the prologue, and whose tale in the whole work is the one that's told first. As I read the Middle English, follow the text on your handout under Task 2 and enjoy the illustration which you see on the slide, which is reproduced on your handout. This is an illustration that has been lovingly drawn on a contemporary manuscript that was, we think, created only a couple or so years after Chaucer died in 1400. So as I read, you'll have to imagine that Chaucer has just described the knight, the father of the squire, and now he turns to his son. With him there was his son, a young squire, a lovier and a lusty bachelor, with lockes crulle as they were laid in press, of 20 year of age he was, I guess. Of his stature he was of even length, and wonderly deliver, and of great strength. And he had been sometime in Chevauchée, in Flanders, in Artois, and Picardy, and borne him well, as of so little space, in hope to stonden in his lady grace. Embrooded was he, as it were a mead, all full of fresh flowers, whift and reed. Singing he was, of floating all the day. He was as fresh as is the month of May. Short was his gown, his sleeves long and wide. Well could he sit on horse and fair the ride. He could a songed maken well indeed, jouster and eke dance, and well portray and read. So hot he loved, that by nectartale he slept no more than doth the nightingale. Courteous he was, lowly and serviceable, and carp before his father at the table. Now, in describing his pilgrims, Chaucer always follows, broadly, three areas or three topics. The first one is estate, or status. The second is array, or the clothing or appearance. And the third is the condition. As English society was, and still is to an extent, so obsessed with class, his first task, very early on in the portrait, was to identify the social position and job of the pilgrim, to identify where the pilgrim stood in the social hierarchy of the medieval world. This was known as the estate, and we get our word status from this, as well as estate. Then he would consider how the pilgrim dressed, and in the 14th century, clothes were a big signifier of rank, as they still are today. But in the medieval society, there were rules called sumptuary laws, which dictated what certain classes of people could wear. This was, we think, all done to make sure that those at the bottom of the social heap weren't beginning to rival the finery and the power and the status of the aristocratic classes by dressing up or dressing outside of what was thought to be appropriate. Even though society at this time in the late 14th century was beginning to become more tolerant about breaking these laws, the squire here is clearly a dedicated follower of fashion, and he could get away with it because his father was a knight. The last part of the description involved what was called the condition, which is slightly more tricky, but this sounds like our modern word condition, and you want to understand this as personality or character traits. So you've heard me do it. Now I'd like you to reread the original Chaucerian verse in Task 2, this original portrait of the squire. Then I'd like you to read through the modern version, but you'll notice there are gaps, and I'd like you to fill in those gaps by choosing the words that make sense, that you think make sense, from the box on your handout. You'll find this in Task 3. And then once you've filled in those gaps, think back to what I was saying about descriptions of estate or status, his array or clothing and appearance, and his condition, his kind of moral personality or character. I'm going to set 2 challenge questions as well. So you can discuss these or think about them individually or discuss them in groups. What do you think Chaucer is suggesting about the squire's character from the lengths that he goes to, or that the squire goes to, in order to enhance his appearance? He clearly wants to be seen as a very smart guy. And what do you think is more important to the squire? Looking good, enjoying music and daydreaming about girls, or pleasing his father? The second question is this. What foreign language can you hear lurking behind these words in Middle English, in this description of the squire? And thinking back to what you've learnt about Chaucer, I hope today, why might this language be appropriate to describe an aristocratic, upper-class teenager? Okay, so how did he get on? So estate or status. Where is this? It's always usually at the beginning. And here we see, and here Chaucer described the squire as, with him there was his son, a young squire. And so being a son meant that there were expectations towards his parents, towards his father, and being a squire, these were of a particular kind. He needed to learn from his father all the skills of martial prowess, of weaponry and war, and courtesy and nobility, how to act nobly. All of these skills he needed to learn from his father. Okay, so did you spot the moments where array, or his dress and appearance, was being described? Let's have a look. So, with loques crulla, as they were laid in press. This is something which, a description which, with his curly locks, as if they had been put in irons, in hair curlers, which is suggesting he's going to some lengths to look good. And embroidered was he, as if it were a meader all full of fresh flowers, white and a reader. And the reader there being a kind of very symbolic colour for Chaucer, which symbolises passion and fresher flowers and embroidery. He's certainly someone who's very fashion forward, wanting to make a striking impact. And he's also quite natural, fresher flowers. Love for Chaucer was part of God's creation and part of nature which he celebrated. And then this final, as we can see in the illustration, short was his gown, and sleeves long and wide. So no matter how impractical these sleeves were for horsemanship and riding, he wanted to make a statement. He wanted to have the very latest fashion in the 1380s, these long sleeved gowns and short tunics, which revealed his tights and his strong legs. So this is a squire, a teenager, who's very much concerned with his appearance. And so, lastly, to the condition or personality of the squire. This comes right at the end of the portrait. Curtes he was lowly and serviceable, and carved before his father at the table. And you can hear, because this comes at the end, his personality, his kind of moral bearing, is centered around the behavior that he needs to show towards his father. And there's only 2 lines of these, whereas before the rest of the portrait is very much taken up with a description of his appearance. And by doing so, Chaucer seems to suggest that there's far much less excitement that the squire feels in this than he does in wearing the latest fashion or learning poetry or chasing girls. So before, in most of this portrait, the squire is seen preening and enjoying himself. And aren't teenagers always going to do what they like, regardless of what their parents want them to do? This seems to be the question that Chaucer is asking. So, the description of array mirrors how the squire spends more time on his appearance and the things he loves than meeting his parents' expectations. But has that ever changed? And the courtly behaviour is described using French words French was still in the 1380s very much the language of the educated elite, but that was about to change. Chaucer changed that, because Chaucer heightened forever the prestige in which English was held as a language. And so we reach the end, as Chaucer would have had it. And I hope that this talk has given you just a brief glimpse or an amuse-bouche, something to whet the appetite for the telling insights that he is able to bring into his description of human nature, of his close eye for detail, and the inventive way he plays with the resources of the English language. By doing all of this, Chaucer, as I said, altered forever the prestige in which English as a language was held, and he created a tradition that was to become known as English literature. Dryden was right in calling him the father of English poetry, because in so many ways, Chaucer really was the daddy. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and now it's over to you. You can try your hand at the creative writing exercises which are listed under task 4 in the handout. You can do this now, or you can take it home to do as homework. Enjoy, and as Chaucer would say, very well.